The question is, the answer is, because it takes too much time in class, okay? So I never do review sessions. Get together with your colleagues and do review sessions. That's what you've been doing all weekend, having fun with your colleagues. So we're going to pick up with our homeworks talking about regulation of fluid balance and electrolytes during exercise. Dr. Lukemeyer would be very excited about this. He does a lot of work with fluid balance and electrolytes, okay? We already know during exercise, plasma volume goes down, okay? Because of sweating, other factors. But what does that cause? Causes an increase in hydrostatic pressure, tissue osmotic pressure, decreased plasma water contact via sweating, and you get a decrease in blood pressure and a strain on the heart due to that. So we want to maintain plasma volume. Why would we want to do that? What does plasma volume do for us maintaining it? Or conversely, what happens if we lose too much plasma volume? Increases our what?
We lose it and decreases our blood pressure.
What does it do to blood specifically if we lose it?
Osmolality goes up.
Viscosity. So now we're pumping a viscous substance through the pipes, right? So, so if you lose plasma volume, your blood can become sludgy. That's what happens with the heartstrings. Now your heart has to pump a more viscous blood through there, which is going to increase pressure. Okay, so we don't want that to happen. We want to kind of, again, keep a range of plasma volume that we have in there. So there's going to be a number of ways that we can look at that, okay? So the correct fluid balance. Posterior pituitary gland is going to be one. Adrenal cortex is going to have an effect on it. And it's all going to have an effect on the kidneys with regards to how we maintain plasma volume, okay? So somebody tell me something about osmotic pressure.
Pressure exerted by proteins.
And so if we're talking about osmotic, what are we talking about?
Cellulosis.
Pretty much water is what we're talking about with regards to that, okay? So as a refresher of that, let's take a look at this. So if you have a experimental setup that has two tubes, A and B, that are hooked at the bottom, and there is a selectively permeable membrane at the bottom of that tube that only allows the fluid to go back and forth through those. And then in this instance, it's glucose molecules that we have in the experimental setup. What will happen is, if only the fluid or water can move back and forth across that membrane, what it will do is it will change the volume based upon the number of solutes that are available. So you can see on the right side, B, there's more glucose molecules than there are on the left side in A. And in number 1, the volume is the same, so that the concentration of those molecules, or the osmolality, would be different, okay? And so if water is able to freely move back and forth across that membrane, what it will do is it will concentrate it so the concentration is the same, so that you have the same number of glucose molecules in a appropriate volume compared to the B side of it, okay? And so what osmotic pressure is now if we wanted to force that to the volumes back equal again, we would apply a weight, or in this case we could do a syringe, and we could determine how much pressure is in the tube to equal those volumes out. And when they're equal, that pressure that we're applying in a downward manner, the force, is osmotic pressure. And so that's going to be important when we're talking about this specific hormone coming up, is because it's going to sense osmotic pressure in the tissues related to what's happening with the number of solutes in solution. Okay? Question about that? This is a little bit of a chemistry work back to our old days. How many people have taken chemistry? Did you remember that at all from chemistry? I'm sure you did. You're so sure. Next time I'm going to have you define it. Okay? So,
I actually have a question on the first slide.
first line. Okay.
If you're decreasing plasma volume, why would your hydrostatic pressure go up?
So explain it to me. Why do you think it would? First of all, tell me what hydrostatic pressure is.
The pressure on the wall of the capillaries from the fluid.
Okay, so think about why that might happen. You think it would, but it has related to that viscosity, is now you have that sludge that you're trying to push through there. So, and because you're trying to push it through harder, and it increases the hydrostatic pressure and the osmotic pressure on there. So, it's all related to the viscosity of that thing. So, now we're in the posterior pituitary gland. So, what is released from the posterior pituitary gland? That's oxytocin. What's produced in the posterior pituitary? Yeah, only release. ADH is produced by the hypothalamus. Okay. So if we look at this side of the diagram, we're going to start with the green arrows. High blood osmotic pressure stimulates hypothalamic osmoreceptors. Okay. So osmoreceptors in the brain. Okay. Cause the hypothalamus to synthesize and release ADH that then travels down to posterior pituitary and released. And what happens is we get a effect on the kidneys where we retain more water, we're decreasing our urine output, okay? Sweat glands decrease water loss by perspiration from skin, and arterioles constrict, which increase blood pressure, okay? So all those would be considered good, is that correct? It's relative, yeah. So I would say that this one is good, okay? I would say that this one is good, okay? The middle one could be either way, right? If you're telling something to stop water loss by sweating, is that going to have some consequences? Yeah, so if you do that, you have to balance that. What's more important? Is it more important for us to retain fluid, to retain plasma, or is it more important for us to dissipate heat? And so the body has to decide which one is which. If we have to choose that, there's going to be consequences, right? So let's say if we stop producing sweat, we may increase core temperature to a certain degree. Now we're going to maybe compromise our performance because our core temperature is increased. Conversely, if we decide to sweat, what's our consequences? We're going to lose too much, and everything that we talked about on the previous slide, increased heart strain, maybe decreased blood pressure, is all going to have an impact on our performance as well. So there has to be kind of a balance there to decide which one we're going to do. And so at that point, the body will decide which one's probably more important, okay? And a lot of times, heat dissipation will lose out based upon that, okay? So obviously, this is a negative feedback, so low blood osmotic pressure inhibits hypothalamic osmoreceptors, inhibition of ADH, so everything would then stop at that point, okay? Negative, your traditional negative feedback loop. Questions on that? So it's all about the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and it's sensing it as blood circulates through the hypothalamus, just as it would. Hypothalamus is pretty important for everything, okay? So it reduces water loss from the body to maintain that plasma volume, okay? We already said that the kidneys are going to resorb it, okay? Increases during exercise 60% VO2 max, okay? So as we start to exercise, we're going to see an increase in antidiuretic hormone, okay? You guys can look through that, we talked about that. There's a nice picture of it. But here is, so this diagram is no different than this diagram that I showed you, okay? Same diagram, I think this one actually is from text, so I'll just have to go like that. So here's what happens to plasma ADH. Relatively stable, okay? Until we get to 50 to 60% VO2 max, then we see an increase in plasma ADH. And it's a pretty large increase. If you notice the axes on this figure, it's an 800% change in the amount of ADH at max exercise. Okay? So that's a lot of difference in resting and max exercise concentrations of ADH. Okay? So again, usually around 50 to 60% VO2 max, you start to see an increase in that concentration, and it steadily inclines with maximal exercise. Okay?
That's 0% change at that point.
0% change. So exactly. So is that 0% ADH in the plasma?
8 milliosmoles.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is you're going to have a plasma ADH concentration in your blood. Okay, but there's no change until you start to see exercise at 50 to 60% VO2 max. So that's a
So
great.
that's just above 0, that line?
So what it's not talking about in this line, this is not a concentration. So it's the change.
Oh.
So the change would be, let's say you have 20%, you have a concentration at 20%,
Got it.
and then you had a concentration at baseline. You're looking at the percent change. So from baseline to 0, there was no change. But is there plasma ADH in the blood? Yes. So, and then what you have at 60, let's say 80%, and baseline is a change. So here there was no change, and here there was a positive change, okay? So now there is more plasma ADH in the bloodstream. But the one before it there was still ADH in there, but there was no increase from about 10% to 50%, 60% VO2, okay? So make sure you keep track of this. When you're talking about a change, that's not an absolute value. You're talking about something changing from usually baseline is when you're talking about, okay? Good point. Questions on that? I would never ask you something like that. What are the absolute concentrations of ADH in the blood? If I didn't tell you what they were in class, I wouldn't do that to you. Not that kind of guy, okay? So now we're going to look into the other ones that we were talking about with regards to this slide back here was adrenal cortex. So we're going to look at the adrenal glands and specifically what the adrenal glands do in regards to the hormones and what their functions are, okay? And so when looking at the adrenal glands, you have to look at two different sides of the adrenal glands. There's an adrenal cortex and an adrenal medulla, okay? And so the adrenal medulla is going to be responsible for short-term stress, okay? Whereas the adrenal cortex is going to be related to more prolonged stress, and it happens to be related to how they're controlled, okay? So let's start with the short-term stress and looking at the adrenal medulla, okay? So stress, in this case, is sensed by the hypothalamus, sent through neurons down to the spinal cord, okay? Sympathetic ganglion, we're going to get sympathetic fibers that go to the adrenal medulla. Is the adrenal medulla the inside or the outside? It's the inside. So we're talking about this area right here, okay? Adrenal medulla, okay? When the sympathetic stimulation comes down, it's going to secrete amino acid-based hormones and these catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, okay? So, does anybody know, and this was a answer on the quiz bowl. Our quiz bowl team finished 14th out of 29, is that right? Yeah, so a little above 50%. Those 3 people are no longer at SMU. I took their IDs and banned them from campus, so they're no longer with us. If you guys want to be on the team next year, I would expect us to be in the top 5. Top 1 gets to go to the national meeting and compete against other regional chapters. That's where I wanted us to be. So one of the questions at Texas ACSM was name the catecholamines. So what are name 2 catecholamines? There's 3 of them. And what's the third one? No. Anybody know? We don't ever talk about it because we're always talking about exercise and cardiovascular regulation. Dopamine is the third catecholamine. We got that wrong, and I ran down and I choked one of our contestants out. That's why she's no longer with us. No. So we don't ever talk about dopamine because it's technically a catecholamine, but we really don't ever talk about it with regards to exercise. Okay. So now you know. So if you get that question and say, name the catecholamines, your answer is what?
Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine.
Serotonin. Throw something in there, okay? So what do catecholamines do then? So increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, liver converts glycogen to glucose and releases glucose to the blood. Nice, because that's what we are always talking about is maintaining plasma glucose, blood glucose, okay? Dilation of the bronchioles, changes in blood flow patterns leading to decreased digestive system activity and reduced urine output and increased metabolic rate. So, if this stress is exercise, and we get a release of catecholamines from the adrenal medulla due to sympathetic stimulation, are these appropriate responses?
Yes.
Would you want an increased heart rate with exercise?
Increased energy output, increased ventilation.
Yes. Increased blood glucose, dilation of the bronchioles so that we can bring in more air, change our blood flow patterns to working skeletal muscle as opposed to digestive system, reduce our urine output, okay, which does what for us as well? Saves plasma volume, so that seems like that would be a good one. And are we going to need an increased metabolic rate to fuel exercise? I think those are all pretty good responses then, aren't they? Okay. Again, those all happen relatively quickly, correct? Short-term responses to stress. Does your heart rate go up during exercise pretty quickly? Yeah, it doesn't lag behind, usually when you start exercising. Blood pressure will. If you didn't have all of these happening in a short period of time, okay, probably likely that we wouldn't be able to exercise. We'd have to ramp it up, have something, and then once all of those were released, and if they were in a slow pattern, it would be hard for us to exercise immediately, okay? So again, short-term stress is going to be responsible. The adrenal medulla will secrete catecholamines and cause those short-term stress responses, okay? So I gotta look at this because I think we go into the next one. We may talk about the catecholamines in a couple slides, but we're now going to talk about the adrenal cortex, okay? So the adrenal cortex is, if this was the inside, the adrenal cortex is now what? The outside, okay? And the hormones that are secreted from the adrenal cortex are what? Mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. Now, tell me what's the difference. Mineralocorticoids do what? Obviously, they retain sodium and water loss by the kidneys, increase blood volume and blood pressure. Now, tell me a hormone that's a mineralocorticoid. Aldosterone. Tell me a glucocorticoid.
Cortisol.
Okay? So, with regards to fluid balance, we're going to talk about aldosterone right now, and then we'll get back to cortisol. Okay? So in this case, we get the same stress, which is what? Exercise, right? We now get corticotropin releasing hormone released from the hypothalamus, goes down to, in this case, what is this right here? That's the anterior pituitary in this picture, okay? I don't think it identifies that. Oh, it does right there, anterior pituitary, okay? Anterior pituitary releases this. What is it? ACTH. See, it's slower for us and louder for us.
Adrenocorticotropic hormone.
That's correct, which has an effect on the adrenal cortex, and you're going to secrete steroid hormones, in this case aldosterone and glucocorticoids, okay? So, aldosterone is retention of sodium and water by the kidneys, thereby increasing blood volume and blood pressure. Okay, so we may be talking about what we talked about in regards to the osmotic pressure is if you are retaining more solute, which is sodium, fluid is going to follow that to maintain a concentration gradient. Okay, so that's how we're going to maintain plasma volume with aldosterone. So let's take a look at aldosterone. Control of sodium resorption and calcium or potassium secretion, okay? And it's part of a system, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So it's not just aldosterone working singularly as a hormone, but it has a 3-hormone system that works together, and they all increase during exercise, okay? And how is it stimulated? Increased potassium concentration or decreased plasma volume is gonna have an effect on it with those osmoreceptors. How many people know of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system? Could you, right now, diagram it out for us, Austin, how it works? Okay, see what you got. This is called flipping the craft classroom, by the way. Now Austin has become the teacher and I'm the learner.
Okay. It's gonna get combined with angiotensinogen. It's gonna then get converted from that into angiotensin 1. It's gonna get go to ACE in the lungs, get converted to angiotensinogen 2 or tensin 2.
If you don't get this right, we all die.
It's gonna go from there. Let's start right here first. And then at that point it becomes aldosterone, correct? Which is the
I'm the student, you're the teacher. That's pretty good. Let's see if he's correct in most of this. Okay? So, dehydration, sodium deficiency, or hemorrhage. What's hemorrhage do? Yeah. So, have any of you guys experienced hemorrhage? All right. You ever lost a large amount of blood due to an injury or stepping on an IED in Iraq? Okay. So this is something that Dr. Crandall's lab studies quite a bit, is hemorrhage and how you control blood volume in relationship to a injury or loss of blood volume. So obviously the military is very interested in understanding hemorrhage and how it is you can maintain blood pressure in soldiers that have experienced a horrific injury, okay? So all of these three together are a little different, but they're gonna have an impact on decreases in blood volume. So decrease in blood volume actually decreases blood pressure, and so the juxtaglomerular cells of the kidney are going to sense a decrease in pressure, and they're going to increase renin production, okay? Renin will act upon angiotensinogen, which is produced by the liver, and then you get increased angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 now has to go to the lungs because of the location of angiotensin converting enzyme, which is ACE, okay? ACE then converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, okay? Angiotensin 2 has two effects. The first one will go to the adrenal cortex and stimulate the release of aldosterone, okay? And then the second one, it has a direct effect on arterioles and cause vasoconstriction of the arterioles. The vasoconstriction leads to an increase in blood pressure. Now, if we go back to aldosterone, aldosterone is going to have increased sodium and water resorption and increased secretion of potassium and hydrogen in the urine, ultimately leading to an increase in blood volume and bringing pressure back up to normal, okay? So in this instance, we're talking about blood pressure, but if we were to look at it down here, we're also maintaining plasma volume. So it has a direct effect on plasma volume. So this is a pretty complicated process here involving renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, okay? So this is why it would then technically be what? A prolonged stress, or take a long time for this to have an effect on this. If we had to do all of this right here in order to maintain plasma volume during exercise, we probably would be in trouble, wouldn't we? Yeah, so this is going to be a more long-term stress. So if you're dehydrated over maybe longer periods of time, or maybe you're hemorrhaging blood and you don't know you're hemorrhaging blood, maybe this is a cascade that would do this, okay? So, more importantly, if we are affecting blood pressure, is this a way we could potentially control blood pressure? Okay, so how do we do that? There's specific medications out for this system. Say it again, no?
ACE inhibitor.
It's exactly right. ACE inhibitors, okay, are, you see in my cursive writing here coming out. ACE inhibitors are drugs that you can give to individuals that will control hypertension, okay? So in this cascade, ACE was converting angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and we were getting a vasoconstriction and an effect on the adrenal glands, causing us to increase water. We increase blood volume, and then we increase blood pressure. If we're hypertensive, we don't want to increase blood pressure. We want blood pressure to go down, so we might use an ACE inhibitor to lower blood pressure in this case, okay? So, does anybody see a problem with that? Yeah, so the problem that we have with exercise, this is obviously an active process, and if we have a drug on board that is blocking this, is it possible we have a problem maintaining plasma volume if you're on an ACE inhibitor? Yeah, potentially. What's another drug that might be used in combination with an ACE inhibitor? Anybody know? Which would decrease blood volume. We talked about the hormone. What's the other hormone that was regulating blood volume? Was released from the posterior pituitary? ADH. So ADH is anti-diuretic hormone, which was preserving plasma volume. What might else I give then, which would be opposite of anti-diuretic hormone? Give you a diuretic. What would a diuretic do? Increases urine output and decreases blood volume, decreasing blood pressure. So if you're hypertensive and let's say the ACE inhibitor isn't working as well, they may give you a diuretic in conjunction with it that makes you pee more to get rid of that blood volume, okay? So, but again, now we're doing this to lower blood pressure, but if we do those things, could we impair exercise? Yeah, and so now you have to think about that and potentially individuals that might have it. And so, Austin, you know anybody, is anybody in your clientele on any of these drugs, like ACE inhibitors and antidiuretics? Yeah, so yeah, there you go. So now you have to know this pathway to understand what those drugs are doing so that you don't put these individuals at risk for exercise, okay? Questions on the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system? Gotta love that, huh? Two of my favorite slides in physiology are this and this, because they're just beautiful in their complexity, but once you get it, it's just like, wow. And Austin did a pretty good job there. I mean, we probably would have survived if it was life and death based upon his flipped of the classroom, okay? So pretty impressive to me. So let's take a look at these hormones during exercise. Again, we're looking at percent change on the y-axis. So rather than absolute concentration of these during exercise. And so if we look at renin activity, it's the blue line, okay? It's going to start to increase gradually until we get to about 50, 45%, and then you see a large increase, okay? Just like what we saw with ADH, around 50 to 60, you're going to start to see a big increase in these so you can maintain plasma volume. Angiotensin 2, red line, again, small increase, and then a more steep increase, 45, 50% VO2 max. And then aldosterone, largest increase, but it increases even further at that 45 to 50% VO2 max. So again, in order for us to maintain plasma volume during exercise, okay? So same figure that we saw with ADH, percent change here in the hormone concentration, and this would be an increase in intensity. So we're increasing the intensity with that as well, okay?
You only need a little bit for a lot of aldosterone, a little bit of precursor.
Yeah, and so depends on the how that system works with regards to the percent changes. There may be small levels of aldosterone and all of a sudden you pick them up, okay? With regards to that. So what would happen now if we looked at that over time, okay? So here we have some different figures for us. So we have two axes, okay? Two y-axes. One is change in plasma volume, okay? And then we have the second y-axis, which is aldosterone concentration. So this the left axis is with relationship to the red figure, red line, which is plasma volume. So we're looking at changes in plasma volume. We don't know what the exercise this is, so it's a little limited in this, but we're exercising from 0 to 120 minutes. So it has to be endurance exercise for us to exercise for that long period of time, 2 hours. And in that 2 hour period, our plasma volume, you see there's a steep decrease in plasma volume right at the onset of exercise. It goes from about 0 to maybe 8% change in plasma volume. Then it kind of levels off and will gradually decrease as it goes down, okay? And then hopefully we should see our aldosterone then go up to match these decreases in plasma volume, okay? As we get decreases in plasma volume, it's going to change the osmotic pressure sensed by the hypothalamus and go with that. Again, this is a system that's going to take some time for us to get. So even though we get a peak concentration in aldosterone after 2 hours of exercise, what do you notice about plasma volume?
Starting to level off.
It's starting to level off, but it's still what? Minus 15 from where it started, okay? So that goes again to the long-term effects of this hormone. It takes some time to get it there, and you'll start to see it starts to level off so we don't lose as much plasma volume, but we don't see a big upturn where plasma volume is coming back up to 0. That doesn't happen, okay? Due to the length of time it takes this to work, okay? So the question is a 15% change in plasma volume problematic?
Not too bad. I mean, you're dehydrated, but
Yeah, so what should we be doing in that 2 hour period to potentially help that out? Drink
Drink
fluids,
water.
replenish the plasma volume with that, okay? So we don't know, we're assuming that this is an exercise trial, that they're not replenishing fluids because that's a pretty big drop in plasma volume in that 2 hour period of time, so. But normally you'd be having individuals replenish that by drinking water or other fluids to keep that plasma volume up. The problem with that is what? You guys know anything about thirst? Other than the fact that when you're thirsty, you drink something.